All right, well, the clock has struck 3:30, so it's time for another session of our Survive and Thrive series. Thank you so much for joining us again. My name is Ryan Weissmueller. I am the president of Intrepid Solutions, and we partner with CEOs and management teams of entrepreneurial companies, meeting them where they are and helping them along their journey. And certainly an interesting journey right now. So we have had some changes in the last week or so. We'll certainly talk through that, some updates, and most importantly, the goal really of this series and what we try to share with you is actions to take and some steps moving forward. There is so much information flying, so much speculation, so much conjecture that it is very easy just to be inundated by news, by doom and gloom, by opinions. And we are firm believers that the only path ahead is the path forward. So hopefully we can equip you with a few important steps that can be taken as we will talk through this today. So our agenda, we are going to talk through some market updates as always. We will also some relief option updates, and there have been some big ones over the course of this last week that we can share. And then finally, really best practices, next steps, some actionable information that you can take. And again, our approach is one of very pragmatic. We're not going to sit here and say we have all the answers, but I think there are definitely some proven steps, actionable steps that can be taken in light of these very uncertain times. And lastly, at the end, we always try and leave a few minutes for Q&A. What I would say is there is a Q&A box in your Zoom webinar there. Go ahead and use that. And feel free to submit a question. I did get questions over the course of the week, which is super helpful. We'll address those briefly as well. But if you do have any new questions, by all means, feel free to include that in the Q&A box. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. And first off, I think important just to talk about, as we always do, we start with what's going on. Certainly from our perch, we have a unique pulse just in terms of all the folks we're talking about in the business continuum, not just our clients themselves, but the banks, the CPA firms, law firms, et cetera, that we're interacting with. So I think it gives us an interesting bird's eye view of what's happening. And some of that, certainly we want to share as well as some macroeconomic items. So the first thing that I will share, and I'm stealing this, I recognize that, but I heard this COVID pandemic framed in perhaps the most sensible way I have thus far over the course of this last week, and it was referred to as a natural disaster on steroids. And for me at least, I think that was a very good way to look at it. Natural disasters, they're not permanent. But by account, they can change the way we look at the world and change the way we do certain things. You can certainly look at the Hurricane Katrina's, some of the larger natural disasters that we've had. So certainly the effects of this far more wide ranging. But it is an event. It will pass, and it's just a question of what it looks like on the other side. One other thing I think that's been very important is certainly as we've gotten, a little bit further out from these original government, shutdowns, the stay-at-home orders, is really watching what some of the data has told us and what it's indicated about kind of where we are relative to where we've been in the past. And I mentioned this last week, I'll say it again. If you look at what we all felt was a very sizable hit to our 401ks, sizable drop to the S&P 500, if you compare that in historical standards to the crash of '87 to what happened during the Great Recession in '08-09, it was a very small blip. And by the same token, a key difference, and I think we know enough, we've seen enough to prove this, is that unlike 2008, 2009, today the credit markets are flowing very freely. That was not happening back then. If you recall, the credit markets were essentially frozen. The consumer is not broke. Going into that, then the consumer was broke, very debt heavy, underwater on homes. That's not the case today. And actually the real estate market, the residential real estate market is still by a lot of accounts very healthy. And then the third key differentiator is the government has been very proactive. And I think partly because of the lessons of that Great Recession. But at the time, the government was probably slower than they needed to be to react to some of what was happening. Whether you agree or disagree exactly with what the government's done, I think it is very safe to say that both sides of the aisle have tried to move very quickly. So some key distinctions, key differences. As of today, 47 states have reopened. There are still 3 states, I want to say New Jersey, Delaware, and Illinois maybe, that are still under their shelter-in-place orders, if you will, until the end of the month, or I want to say into early June, and we'll see what happens from there. But 47 states have at least initiated some measures of reopening. The key thing with that is really, we've kind of kept our eye on what starts happening in the middle of June. A lot of states started reopening earlier this month. There's obviously a lag time to see what really happens in terms of, do we see additional hotspots, flare-ups with the virus, and really, keeping a close eye on that. We've seen cases go up, but that's also a function as testing just continues to expand. So that's not necessarily an indication that our problem has worsened. If we see flare-ups after states have reopened, and certainly by June 15th, we're going to start seeing some of that. So that's somewhat of a key time frame to keep an eye on, just to understand what's happening. A couple other key points, those of you who get, Moderna, who's a pharmaceutical company, they indicated they had very results at stages of their clinical trial vaccine. They're fast tracking that. There's a lot of talk about a vaccine really being key, and even taking apart the medical efficacy for a moment, just key to the consumer psyche. And as we've talked about, the consumer is driving everything here. And then the other big piece that I point out today, just something to keep an eye on, is the impact of California. There has been talk of Los Angeles County being shut down for potentially another 90 days. California, obviously a massively large economy, not just to our state or to our country, but to the world. So the impact of that, there could be some trickle-down effect in a lot of different businesses, so something to keep an eye on. On the workforce side, so one key piece, and I know this is known, we've heard this from companies, that their employees don't want to come back because they're making good money on unemployment. The thing that I'll remind everyone, those additional federal unemployment benefits, they run out July 31st. So unless those are extended, even though employees aren't necessarily thrilled about going back to work today, if they're doing well on unemployment, that's not going to be a permanent impact. So that's one key piece to watch out for. And then, also just, again, the trend of remote work. And you're seeing it's in the news, what certain companies are doing in terms of their own workers, how they're setting up workspaces. It's going to be very interesting to see what office concepts, are those a thing of the past? You have to wonder. I even saw something with gyms in, I believe it was in South Korea or maybe Hong Kong, where literally they've got dividers, glass between treadmills. So what does that office environment look like? Going to be very, and how is that in comeback? It varies wildly. And, there've been a lot of polls taken. So I think just understanding where that employee dynamic is going to be important. We've talked about consumer driving anything that is still going to be the case. You can read all the economic information you want, but if the consumer's going out, not buying, we're going to have problems. Now, one thing that had really uniformly encouraging, and there was a study done just based on cell phone hotspot, the consumer's moving, the consumer's mobile. So that is a good sign that at least trying to resume some sense of normalcy. The thing to watch will be, once these restrictions are lifted, does the consumer come out and there's all this pent-up demand and then a little bit of a flat line? Does it increase slowly? That's really going to be the biggest indicator of long-term stability and where we end up. And then as far as Main Street, we always like to talk about this, and certainly there have been some dominoes that have fallen over the past week, as well as just what we're seeing. One thing, obviously, and some of this has been in the news, some of it's not, but a lot of retailers are failing. Two big ones that were announced, JCPenney filed bankruptcy. Pier 1 announced that they're closing all their locations. Certainly some restaurant chains have made some dramatic cutbacks, Steak and Shake being one of them. So something you're probably going to continue to see. Now, the caveat, and again, the thing to be careful with, some of those companies, JCPenney we've been reading about, was on death's door for years, sick going in. So it's when the healthy companies go in and start failing that I think we really need to get concerned. But that is certainly an important distinction. As a company that went sick going in, this might have just been the final nail in the coffin. Those healthy ones, when they start dying off, that may be suggestive of a far more systemic problem. And we have not seen that in mass yet. Companies in general are opening up. They're being cautious, but they're opening up. We've seen some supply chain issues, or at least just some inconsistencies, so something certainly to keep an eye on. There's still a good bit of uncertainty among businesses out there. PPP money for most companies is past the 50% mark in terms of, it's getting close to running out. But the other key, and I think the other thing that's important both for the consumer for businesses, if you look at this from kind of a macroeconomic perspective, all the stimulus money that's flooded into the economy hasn't been fully baked in yet. So there's still an element of fear. There's still an element of hoarding of some capital. Does that get released? What does that look like? But just because trillions of dollars are pumped into the economy does not mean that the effect of that is instantaneous. And we are certainly seeing that both in the consumer front and the business front. So let's talk about seemingly everybody's favorite topic these days, which is small business relief and specifically the PPP. So we'll start there. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just tackle a couple of the questions I got around PPP during this, and then we'll see what we have time for at the end. Just because there is some really important information that I want to make sure we're able to cover and get to today. First off is there are funds still available. There was a lot of expectation the second round of PPP was going to run out extremely quickly. That was not the case. I think in large part that's a result of the fact that the government put some fear into the hearts of many that they could get in trouble for taking the money or certainly lack of clarity around forgiveness. So there is still money out there. It's going to be curious if at some point they just cut that off, even though there is funds remaining. But technically speaking, you could still apply for loans. I know some banks have stopped taking applications, but it is our understanding that it is still possible. Now, the key piece that's occurred, and this is around the forgiveness side of things, which is why we highlight it separately, is there was some sizable guidance that came out on Friday of last week. Literally got a copy of it sitting in front of me here at my desk, an 11-page forgiveness application from the SBA, the official application that the SBA has put out. And a couple of key notes that I would highlight from that guidance and just some key changes. One thing is they are allowing now kind of an alternative payroll period, if you will. So this was a concern for a lot of companies is, maybe they got their PPP loan the day after, they got their last payroll was funded. So that 8-week period could actually hit them where they might not be able to maximize the payroll usage of those funds. And also the timing of payments. They did make some changes in the language from actually when expenses are paid to incurred. So again, it does not necessarily have to be paid within the 8-week window. So for example, rent, there was conversations around, do we prepay rent? The way this has been revised is actually would allow a company where something like rent was truly expensed, and it became a real expense, even if it was paid 2 days after that 8-week term ended, because it was incurred during the period, for example, and again, depending on how rent is structured, whether it's prepaid or paid in arrears, that those expenses would be eligible. So those are two very key clarifying distinctions, and that should ease some heartburn on the part of a number of businesses out there. And then there was also some additional guidance on the calculation for reduction of forgiveness based on headcount. So as we all know, this program was put in place to try to encourage companies to keep people on payroll or rehire people. A lot of companies weren't able to do that, get back to the same levels of employment. So there is a reduction in the forgiveness, in the amount of the loan that would be forgivable based on how close one is back to that run rate level of 2019 payroll, if you will. And there's a clear calculation within this application. Now, here's a couple of key pieces I'm going to point out on this. And we talked about it last week that for loans $2 million and over, and the Treasury has issued guidance on this, that those are going to be audited by the SBA. For loans under that amount, from everything we are being told, and I have talked to multiple lenders about this, the forgiveness process is going to be 100% bank driven. So I've used this caveat. I think every time we have talked, I'm going to use it again, and I'm sorry if you're tired of hearing it. There is no one application process, soup to nuts. You follow exactly this and you got it nailed down. There is no one PPP forgiveness calculator, and I've seen a number of them. I will say I saw a CPA firm that's actually been updating them fairly frequently and putting guidance out there and some helpful tips. I think that's great as long as they're adding a caveat to it. I've also seen CPA firms who've sent something out and said, here's the forgiveness calculator. It's wrong. So until we see guidance, and it may not even be wrong because, it doesn't even follow a lot of what's in this SBA guidance, but the simple fact of the matter is banks are going to drive this. And I remember, when I was up on my soapbox a little bit before this process even rolled out, that, knowing that banks were going to drive a lot of this, and a lot of banks had different processes. I think I've shared, we've been involved with 18 different lenders through this process. And I think every single one of them was slightly different. Some banks had their own slightly different version of the application. So just because you go fill out this PPP forgiveness app, you might have to fill out a different version from your bank. They might ask for slightly different information. They may have their own PPP calculator they want you to use. So I say that it's good to get guidance. It's good to be prepared. It's good to use some best practices. Don't think you've got it final until you've had that conversation with your bank. And again, for everything under 2 million, that is our understanding of how it's going to operate, is be purely 100% bank driven. Now, there are a number of other changes that are currently under consideration that I think it's important to point out as well. We talked about the deductibility issue, where the IRS issued some guidance that anything that was forgiven, so if you got $200K of payroll forgiven, that payroll was not then deductible on your 2020 tax return. That is something that's working its way through Congress, and they are actually trying to make some modifications to the program, as well as the use percentage. There's some talk, the 75-25, which again was not in the CARES Act specifically, that was SBA guidance, that did not correspond with the initial intent of the law that was passed by Congress. So Congress is looking at putting some language in there to make it tax deductible, putting some language in there to potentially expand the percentage use, potentially expand the time frame within which the money can be used. But those are ifs. We don't know. They're proposed until they're law. I don't know that we can count on any of those things. So don't bet on it. A couple other things I'll just touch on quickly. The Main Street Lending Program, we keep hearing about it. From what I was told a couple days ago, there are ongoing negotiations with lenders. My belief in the folks that I've talked to is they're really trying to get this right, because they don't want to put out a program with flaws, especially what happened with some of the concern around PPP. So I am still optimistic on the program, but the devil's going to be in the details. We need to see, what's involved. I think this could be a solid benefit for a lot of businesses, but we're going to find out. And until we get a little bit further clarity, that one's a bit up in the air. And then the other piece that I'll say by way of updates, and you've probably read about it, there's a lot of talk on stimulus round 4.0. There was the HEROES Act that was passed by the House that was basically dead on arrival in the Senate. There are a ton of things being talked about. I would just caution everyone that there's a lot of speculation until something is put into law or issued in formal guidance, or you get formal guidance from your bank or CPA that is backed by regulations. It's probably not concrete yet. So just something to be very careful about. And really no other updates on any of the other programs, to speak of, no additional programs. There's been some things talked about, but again, nothing concrete. So let's spend the rest of our time talking about what we do with all this. And that's a lot of context, but I think it's important context that'll lead into this. First, peering through the noise, and I think this is certainly very, very important. And now that we are seeing this reopening continue, it's crucial to segregate what is happening in the market relative to your company. Is it because of global actions or because of the company's actions? And so certainly, again, you could see a lift for a period of time that could just be purely because of macroeconomic, changes that are going on, that you may think you've really nailed something in the market only to find that you've now fallen on your face. So as much as possible to peer through that and understand the results that you're seeing, what's driving it. Can you tie something specifically to actions you're taking, or is it more likely that just the ship is rising because the tide is rising? And that's extremely important for obviously the future of your company and before you double down on anything. Second piece is obviously just that post PPP outlook. Those funds are, for some companies, 30% left or less. What does it look like after that? For many companies, they deferred rent during this period, or I'm sorry, they paid rent during this period. Then they might have a deferral because it was advantageous into the PPP. Companies, a number got deferments from their banks or, from their leasing companies, pushed out accounts payable. What does it really look like now that we're getting closer to that? And doing, we've certainly encouraged a regular review of cash flow, at least weekly, sometimes multiple times a week, depending on material changes. But with this impending tail, and also just just an understanding of over the next 60 days, 120 days, even over the next week, how do you generate cash? And how does that play into all this? All those things are extremely important, as well as the flip side, what demands on cash are going to be there. So as we get to this post-PPP world where we're not going to count on any additional funding coming in, and also some of the uncertainty that the whole loan may not be forgiven. I'm certainly optimistic that banks are going to try to encourage forgiveness as much as they can, but it's not the end of the world if 100% is not forgiven, just understanding the ramifications of that. Another piece, and I think, again, this is part of with things reopening, is just the concept of the rotating hats. So in looking at cost structure, which is something we talked about last week, really reevaluating who needs to do what going forward. Are there opportunities for people to wear multiple hats, to wear different hats? Really evaluating needs within the business to operate under what we'll call version 2.0 or version 3.0 for a lot of companies. That plays into how rehires are handled. Are there new hires? Do you insource or outsource even? There may be functions that were, directly employment in the past that you may elect to do on an outsourced basis for a period of time. But again, just understanding this is the perfect opportunity to reassess who's wearing what hats. In some cases, a lot of people are probably wearing multiple hats, but getting that deck stacked and knowing where you're going. Because once things do really start continuing to open, that's not a conversation you want to be scrambling to figure out at that time. So use this for planning, use this to try to get out ahead of it, and to be somewhat methodical with what the right operating structure is from a people perspective. And then lastly, again, we talked about this, but I think something to revisit is just that ROI on spend. And this certainly goes to people, but also much broader than that. Money that's going out the door, what is the return on that capital? Because there are going to be finite resources, perhaps more finite than in the history of your company. How do you best maximize those resources? And it could be a long-term ROI, could be a short-term ROI, but that's really a key piece to evaluate. So, some key takeaways from this and things that I would tell you really to try to put into action if you haven't already. Number one, and we talked about, just what the consumer drives, which is everything, understanding the consumer, understanding their behavior, what they're comfortable with. Again, continuing to monitor, to map that consumer, and that goes to what we talked about with are your actions driving them, or is it more broader economic factors that are driving them? How do you continue to monitor them and what they're doing? How bad do they need or want your product? In some cases, there really is a need-based perspective right now with a lot of what's going on. So someone that's essential to some of these businesses reopening. In other cases, they're more discretionary goods, understanding that of how bad they need or want the product. How do you best reach them? And I think another really key conversation that we're having right now with a lot of businesses is, let's say you've got a case where you're sitting on inventory. Let's say you've got a case where you've got idle labor that you can go ahead and start using. Will the consumer or the customer, it could be B2B, will they take a deal? Because there are certain circumstances where that customer is not going to buy under any circumstance, that you could sell it for zero and they might not be in a position to take it. There's others where you could free up cash by offering, again, because you've got sunk costs, let's say in inventory or idle labor, that could produce. It may be an opportunity to go out there and free up some capital, bring some cash in the door. You've just got to make sure you have somebody to sell to on the other end that can also pay the bill. So something very, very key to look at. The second piece, and I would say this really goes to the whole theme of what we talk about in this whole series, is just focusing on what you can control. You can't control what the government's going to do tomorrow. You can't control the fact that PPP guidance has changed 15 times and that 2,000 different people have their own interpretations of it. What you can do is take steps forward. I think I used what a famous mountain climber once said is, he was stuck in a blizzard, and how do you make it to the top? 3 feet at a time. And you can 3-foot your way, to long-term success. So don't stop moving. Don't get stuck. The wind's blowing. It's blowing hard, but focus on the things that you can control. And there's a lot you still can control. Certainly one thing that we advocate is having scenarios at hand. so that you can decide, okay, depending on what happens, if the consumer bites quickly, we've got option A. If they're a little bit slower, we've got option B. If demand's just not there, here's kind of our more draconian, shrunk down version of our company to ride out the storm. Being ready to respond to that, but taking action. Paralysis right now is perhaps the most damaging thing that can be done. There is going to be a ton of opportunity because just as much as most companies are struggling with this, there's other companies in your markets that are struggling even more. So it's still an opportunity to pick up market share, still an opportunity to be creative, and an opportunity to get momentum, get movement. So focusing on that which you can control is so important. And then the last piece, which we talked about, is ultimately the bank is going to be the decision maker on so many things. You've got to keep them informed. You want to get friendly with them. And they are going to be the decision makers on a lot of this PPP, and they're keenly involved in this Main Street lending program as well. So getting in touch with them, understanding what's going on, don't jump to any conclusions. Even though this application came out, again, the bank may look at it slightly differently in terms of what they want to see. You have to bear in mind as well that these loans, there were different guidance issued over the course of time, and this was actually one of the questions, so I'll dive into this quickly. Folks that got their loan in the very, very first couple days, technically speaking, got their loan under slightly different rules than someone who got it 2 weeks in. And as a result of that, so what happens? Which rules are you bound by? The simple answer is we don't know, but who does is your bank, who's going to ultimately be providing the forgiveness application, the forgiveness guidance, the forgiveness request. So getting out ahead, having that conversation with them. From everything we've been told, the bank guidance is supposed to be issued, we were told, within the next few days. I'm hopeful that it's by the end of this week, but certainly by early next, because reality is we're getting close to DDay on these. I think the first of these loans were funded maybe around the 8th, 9th, somewhere in there of April. We're getting pretty close to that. So that's something to keep a very, very close eye on. Have that conversation with your bank. If they have distribution lists, get on them, understand what they're looking for, when they're looking for it. And the other thing I would say is apply early. If you have your ducks in a row, they have 60 days to approve this. You don't want this hanging out there and not knowing if you're going to get the forgiveness. So find out from them, what are they looking for? Get the information request pulled together. And again, hopefully, if you've been following a lot of what we've been talking about, have very good records. Hopefully a separate bank account made this very easy to follow and to track. And also that gives you an opportunity. As soon as they know anything and reach out, let's say you've still got 25% of your funds left, that might give you an opportunity to spend some money on some things you weren't sure whether or not they were going to qualify. For a lot of companies, they were concerned about can they pay regular bonuses? There's a lot of guidance that regular bonuses are not a problem in any kind, as long as it's ordinary course of business and not anything that would be kind of one-time and egregious, especially if it's something that was earned over the life cycle of the company. But again, the bank is going to be able to provide much better guidance on that. So ask that question so that you can confidently make the decisions as you wind down the last few days of the PPP money. So with that, certainly go ahead. I don't see any other questions popping up in the question bar, so I will go to one more question that has popped up related to the Main Street lending program, and then we'll wrap for the day. Unfortunately, with the MSLP, there was a ton of buzz around it. And again, if you read between the tea leaves a little bit, it does seem that they've been very cautious with this because they took a lot of flack for the PPP and just all the changes. Now, what I will say, is it frustrating? Absolutely. But by the same token, you can't have perfection and speed. And so the PPP, the money got out very, very quickly. You talk to lenders and they've never done anything as quickly as that rolled out. You're going to sacrifice a lot of quality to be able to do that. So that was just the give and take. It seems on the Main Street lending program, they're being far more methodical. Now, bear in mind, again, all the guidance has still said you can have a PPP and the Main Street lending program. It is based off adjusted EBITDA. It is a multiple of that EBITDA, and the loan sizes are as small as $500,000. But should you apply? Maybe is the simple answer. Maybe. I think once the details are out, having that conversation with your banker and really understanding what the global implications of that loan are relative to everything else, because once you have it, bear in mind that is a 4-year loan. It's out there for a while. it could cause some further restrictions for the company. So really key to understand that, but that'd be another case where I would encourage everyone really to have that conversation with their bank, understand the implications, and really look at it on an individualized basis. Because, you know, I'll wrap with this. I've said it many times. There's no silver bullet. Just because your neighbor did something at their business does not mean it's the slightest of a good idea for yours. Really looking at your business, what you need, where you are, where you're going, who your lender is, what kind of capital you have, and coming up with what the best fit is where you are right now and where you want to head. That's the most important thing. You know, that kind of personalized approach to it. And that's certainly what we advocate all day long. So with that, we are at 4 o'clock and we'll go ahead and wrap. I thank you for joining us again today. Next week with the holiday, we are actually taking a week off. So we'll be back with you in 2 weeks on the following Wednesday at 3:30. We'll send out a reminder as well on that. We do, as always, recordings of these, so feel free to pass it on to a colleague who might not have been able to attend. And if there are any massive updates that come out between now and then, I will certainly send out an email blast with anything that we really want to make sure is communicated to you. But thank you for the time. It's always a pleasure. Stay strong out there, stay safe, and we'll see you on the other side. Take care.